Throughout the 2000s, the American Film Institute unveiled an array of lists of movies that embodied what they felt were the best that American cinema had to offer. In 2000, they deemed Some Like It Hot to be the best American comedy. In 2002, they deemed Casablanca to be the best American romance. And in 2006, they released their list of the American cinema's 25 best movie musicals. Unsurprising to many, Singin' in the Rain took the top spot. However, 3 of the films that cracked the top 10 were all released within a year of each other. Mary Poppins, which premiered in August 1964, My Fair Lady, which premiered in October 1964, and The Sound of Music, which premiered in March 1965. Upon release, all 3 films were massive successes both critically and financially, breaking box office records and gaining 35 Oscar nominations with 18 wins. In the decades since their releases, each has continued to enjoy success on television and home video, with each re-release bringing in money and attention for their respective studios and copyright holders. Anniversaries of the films draw articles, television specials, and retrospectives breaking down the popularity and legacy of each film. These 3 films, all released so closely together, have enjoyed unthinkable amounts of success, and they continue to charm audiences old and new. Today, we're going to look at the history of each production, how and why they became so successful, how each has maintained popularity, how each film represents a career peak for a key person involved in their respective productions, and how the 3 all happened at around the same time. Without further ado, let's get started. Mary Poppins is the 1964 adaptation of the popular book series by British author P.L. Travers. The film follows a magical nanny as she takes up employment at the house of the Banks family. Through her adventures with the children, Jane and Michael, she helps to bring love and light back into the family, emphasizing the importance of attentiveness and togetherness. The film was an immediate success, earning 13 Oscar nominations and 5 wins. And it launched its star, Julie Andrews, to international stardom after years of work in the Broadway theater and garnered her the Academy Award for Best Actress. When we look at Mary Poppins, we have to zero in on Walt Disney himself. This was, for many, many years, his passion project, and he worked for over 20 years to simply try to obtain the rights to make it, inspired by his daughter's love for the books. The author of the Mary Poppins books, P.L. Travers, was incredibly hesitant to sign over the rights to her books because she was scared that a film version would take a lot of liberties with her source material, which ended up being a reasonable fear, but I digress. She denied the rights several times as early as 1938. Finally, in 1959, Disney and Travers sat down in person, and Travers was admittedly taken with his presence. She compared him to a charming uncle who dangled a gold pocket watch in front of one's eyes. Finally, in 1961, she flew out to Los Angeles to serve as a creative consultant, which had some interesting results, somewhat depicted in the 2013 film Saving Mr. Banks, and she signed over the rights. P.L. Travers was not the only person who saw Walt Disney like a, quote, charming uncle. For much of the 1950s and 1960s, Walt Disney had taken the persona of Uncle Walt through his weekly television shows Disneyland and The Wonderful World of Color. On the program, Disney took audiences through his archives, his productions, and his theme park in Anaheim, California. Audiences tuned in weekly, feeling a kinship with the producer. For many Americans, he embodied the very characteristics, morals, and advancements portrayed in his work. He was charming, funny, curious, and he carried an element of magic about him. His public persona became part of his brand in the idealization of what Disney meant. Walt's commitment to his empire relied on several factors: brand recognition and reliance, traditional family values, and innovation. Walt made sure that everything put out by his studio was recognizably Disney. Even down to his nonfiction nature documentaries in the early 50s, there's an element of charm, whimsy, and wholesomeness. There was a level of polish added to every Disney production, making sure it was uniquely formulated to fit into its brand, something Walt did on purpose. Even when films started to focus on more mature and strictly adult subject matters as enforcement of the Hays Code was starting to dwindle, Walt went on record as saying, "I don't want to see that kind of thing. If I did, I'd go down to the county nut ward or something." In Disney's eyes, entertainment was meant to push boundaries in technical ways, but it was most effective when it united the family unit. Disney's technical innovations date all the way back to his early career, as his 1928 cartoon short, Steamboat Willie, became the first animated short with synchronized sound. His 1932 cartoon short, Flowers and Trees, was the first animated short to utilize the 3-strip Technicolor process. In 1937, The Old Mill introduced the multiplane camera, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became Hollywood's first full-length animated feature. I could go on, but simply put, Disney was always searching to utilize whatever technological innovations were new, fresh, and exciting. The mixture of Disney's eagerness for innovation, his persona in the media, and his legacy for excellent family-friendly entertainment made for an almost unshakable business. In Sean Griffin's book, Tinkerbells and Evil Queens, The Walt Disney Company from the Inside Out, he writes, Walt Disney so successfully performed authorship of his studio's output during his lifetime that many customers thought that Walt drew all the cartoons himself. At one point during the research of this essay, I upgraded to a Letterboxd Pro account and found that 3 of my 5 most watched directors were exclusively because of their work at Disney. And among those 3, I only recognized one, Woolie Reitherman. With these collaborators, Walt was able to step out in front and, while never denying the hard work poured in by these people, take most of the credit for his company's output. This isn't to say that Walt never gave credit where credit was due, although he had shaky relationships with his animators leading to a strike in the early 40s, and he fought regularly with his own brother over financial issues. But it's important to bring up so one can understand what made Mary Poppins work and what keeps its legacy alive. Walt Disney was, at the end of the day, a businessman, and he worked expertly in the business of family entertainment. Mary Poppins is a Disney film. It is arguably the most Disney film of them all. From the opening notes of Feed the Birds during the opening credits, the audience is clued into the magical aura that pervades the entire film. The colors on screen pop and the atmosphere is cheery, never diving too deeply into true sadness. The characters sing and dance and use their imaginations. They laugh endlessly at silly jokes. They offer charity. The true wholesomeness of Mary Poppins feels removed from any level of pretentiousness or corporate greed. One can feel Walt Disney pouring every ounce of his own humanity and everything he loves about family entertainment into this one film. When Walt was assembling the team for Mary Poppins, he knew he wanted people he could rely on. He wanted to create a version of Mary Poppins that aligned with his image of it, and he wanted people who'd work to make his vision the best that it could be. Robert Stevenson, who directed Old Yeller and The Absent-Minded Professor for the studio to box office success, was brought on to direct. Bill Walsh, a major force in Disney's live-action and television divisions, collaborated on the screenplay with Don DeGrady, an artist in the animation division since the early 1940s. And the Sherman Brothers, who'd provided songs for The Parent Trap and The Sword and the Stone, were tapped to write the songs and score for the film. Like I mentioned earlier, P.L. Travers was brought on as a creative consultant, but very few of her requests/demands were met, and the film ultimately favored Walt's vision of it. And Travers did go on record and say that she didn't care for the movie and would have preferred a British crew, which she ultimately got when the eventual stage adaptation went forward. However, to audiences, what mattered was the final product, and beyond the hummable songs, the lovable characters, and the magical aura that the film emits, audiences were incredibly taken with the technical marvels presented in the film. Like I said, Walt liked utilizing technical advancements and innovations in his work, and audiences at the time would have been in on the act. Mary Poppins wasn't the first time they'd seen live action and animation mixed together. They'd seen it in films like So Dear to My Heart and, that other film he made. They'd seen him talk about audio animatronics on the Disneyland TV show, and here they were in Mary Poppins. Add to this the fantastical sets and acrobatic choreography, the film was an all-around spectacle, mixing a legitimate wow factor with its virtuous tone. After over 40 years in the film industry, and after over 20 years of trying to make the film happen, Mary Poppins became the film that most encompassed the public image of Walt Disney. It was the culmination of a life spent creating a brand and company so unique, adamant, and enjoyable, pushing the boundaries of what technology could achieve in creating an environment meant to entertain and unite the American family. Mary Poppins is able to live on and enchant new audiences because of how specifically it's tied to Walt and the company at large, feeding nostalgic feelings both now and at the time of its release. Mary Poppins was not only one of Walt's biggest critical and financial successes, including being the first of his films to receive a Best Picture nomination at the Oscars, it would be the last major hit of his career. He worked on various productions until he passed in December 1966, but none had quite the impact that Mary Poppins did. Every Friday, Walt would call the Sherman Brothers down to his office simply so they would play Feed the Birds for him, and then he dismissed them for the weekend. Walt knew that Mary Poppins, its whimsy and its charm would be his legacy, and he embraced that as much as he could. My Fair Lady is the 1964 film adaptation of the 1956 Broadway musical, written by Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Lowe, based on the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. The film follows a Cockney flower girl named Eliza Doolittle as she learns proper English speech from Professor Henry Higgins, who's made a bet that he can pass her off as a lady in high society. The film, the most expensive film ever made at the time, was a massive hit, earning 12 Oscar nominations and winning 8, including Best Actor for Rex Harrison, Best Director for George Cukor, and Best Picture. Warner Brothers had a rough 1950s. Jack Warner sunk a lot of money into gimmicks he thought might bring people to the theater and away from their television sets like 3D and CinemaScope. He shut down the animation studio only to reopen it a few months later. He sold off the rights to the entire pre-1950 Warner Brothers catalog to Associated Artists Productions, and contract disputes with some of their television stars led to court battles. In 1956, Warner Brothers was put on the market, but through a secretly organized syndicate, Jack Warner purchased 90% of the stock, becoming the studio's lone new president. Jack would state that the company would be, quote, directed more vigorously to the acquisition of the most important story properties, talents, and to the productions of the finest motion pictures possible. By 1959, My Fair Lady had become the highest-grossing Broadway show of all time, netting $10 million almost 3 years into its run. This was on top of having a best-selling cast recording, which hit number 1 4 years in a row. Meanwhile, Warner Brothers was starting to find success again, producing hit adaptations of stage productions like The Bad Seed, No Time for Sergeants, and Gypsy. Seeing the success that a film adaptation of the country's most popular musical could bring, Jack Warner put down an unprecedented $5.5 million for the film rights to My Fair Lady. When adjusted for inflation, that comes out to nearly $49 million. So just to be clear, Jack Warner paid the modern-day equivalent of almost $49 million just for the chance to make My Fair Lady. The film was bound to be a big deal. Jack Warner, who served as the film's lead producer, wanted a reliable group put together for the film. Cary Grant was offered the role of Henry Higgins, but turned it down, allegedly telling Jack Warner that if Rex Harrison wasn't cast, he wouldn't even go see it. Audrey Hepburn, arguably the biggest star in Hollywood at the time, was cast as Eliza Doolittle. Stanley Holloway, who'd played Alfred Doolittle on Broadway, was brought in after James Cagney turned down the role. And George Cukor, a director who'd worked for almost every major studio during the golden age of Hollywood, was set to direct. Different directors are known for different things. If you're watching a Hitchcock film, you know that it'll be suspenseful. If you're watching a Varda film, you know it'll have an inherent level of curiosity. Throughout his career, George Cukor was known by critics and film fans for how he captured performances. The press primarily focused on how he pulled performances out of actresses, regularly calling him a woman's director, which you should really just read as code for gay. But he pulled out excellent performances all around. Throughout his career, his films and their performances carried a large level of prestige. 7 of his credited films were nominated for Best Picture. He directed 5 Oscar-winning performances and 16 more that were nominated, and he was nominated for Best Director 5 times. It wouldn't be exactly correct to say that Cukor was a universally beloved figure in the film industry. An incredibly notorious instance, documented in William J. Mann's biography of William Haynes, found Clark Gable insisting on Cukor being fired from directing Gone with the Wind, allegedly stating, "I won't be directed by a fairy." Like I said, he was gay, and while this wasn't uncommon as many actors, directors, screenwriters, costumers, etc. were queer, it was also something that was never spoken on. He himself never publicly came out during his lifetime. However, it was sort of an open secret, especially with the lavish, usually weekly parties Cukor would throw for his friends. Still, he was known for the performances he'd pull out of actors and for his relationships to those actors. Take, for instance, that Katharine Hepburn worked with Cukor 8 times, including when she handpicked him to direct her, Cary Grant, and Jimmy Stewart in The Philadelphia Story. Judy Garland also handpicked him to direct her in the 1954 version of A Star is Born. And his filmography is far from monotonous. There's the joyful comedy of Holiday, the whispered, catty conversations of The Women, the suspense, disbelief, and intentional confusion of Gaslight. He would challenge ideas of gender and gender roles in films like Sylvia Scarlett and Adam's Rib. Cukor was an incredibly adept director, and his work was beloved by both critics and audiences, and a great deal of it still holds up splendidly. I bring up Cukor's career specifically because okay, I guess now is as best a time as any. I don't love My Fair Lady. Like, a substantial amount of my research has been spent on figuring out why audiences have enjoyed My Fair Lady so much over the years. Some critics call it a feminist musical, while others don't. Some love the film's heightened glamour and elegance. Some list it as one of Audrey Hepburn's greatest roles, despite the decision, without her prior knowledge, to dub most of her singing in the film. Some people like the dry humor and condescension of Rex Harrison's performance as Henry Higgins. Some find this to be a romantic film, or even to be an anti-romance. Some simply love the music, which, okay, anytime I think about Wouldn't It Be Loverly, it immediately gets stuck in my head, so I get it. There are a multitude of reasons why people continue to enjoy this film, even if I don't personally align with those reasonings. In an article for Time from 2014, Charlotte Alter describes her reading of the film. It's not misogynistic, it's about misogyny. It's not about a genius attempting to transform a weak woman, it's about a strong woman attempting to retain her identity in spite of the controlling machinations of a small-minded man. Lerner and Lowe write songs to humiliate Henry Higgins, to show the audience that he's a jerk and they know it. I can appreciate this reading of the film, as its source material, Pygmalion, was written in the early 1910s as a pro-suffrage political piece aimed at how British politics hindered the rights and agency of women. In my view, though, this sort of falls flat by the last song, I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face, where the audience is seemingly positioned to suddenly root for Higgins and Doolittle to be together. And sure enough, in the last scene, Eliza returns, insinuating their happy ending together. However, Alter also explains the ending as a recognition of Eliza's gender and class positions, especially in the context of the early 1910s. Eliza has no family connections, no money, and no formal education, which means she has nowhere to go but back to the streets. When given the chance between an emotionally abusive man and destitution, she chose the man. Choosing the man doesn't make My Fair Lady a sexist movie, it makes it a movie about a sexist time. Beyond all of this, though, I still find the film to drag a bit, which is sad because, like I said, a lot of George Cukor's work as a director holds up. There's a lot about this film that feels like Cukor playing it safe as a director, seeking to almost make a carbon copy of this stage musical on film. The scenes are overlong, some of the staging either feels forced or too static. The performances, while good for the most part, feel as if they belong more on stage than on film, drawing out many over-the-top expressions that just read as abrasive at times. Even some of the songs overstay their welcome for me. And this isn't me making a statement about how films should never be over a certain amount of time. We're about to talk about The Sound of Music, which is a longer film, and spoiler, I like more. Rather, My Fair Lady almost feels like it's intentionally safe as a film, which, given how much Jack Warner wanted it to succeed, it probably was. So why do I even bring up George Cukor? Well, this became the most critically and financially successful film of his career. In his review for The Hollywood Reporter, James Powers raved, George Cukor's direction is as fresh and crisp as a first night, electric with dramatic tension, keyed high and held. Visually, there has never, not ever, been a motion picture to equal the breathtaking loveliness of My Fair Lady. Technicolor might have been invented for the vivid profusion of color that is flashed on the screen. And okay, yes, I can agree to that last part. Given the extensive budget this film was given, it looks beautiful. The costumes and the settings are meticulously created, and Cukor, with cinematographer Henry Stradling, captures it all extremely well. The film does immerse the viewer in the level of prestige that was regularly associated with Cukor's films. And in the end, George Cukor won the Academy Award for Best Director, his first time winning the award over 30 years after being nominated for the first time for Little Women. While I don't think that many viewers or even Academy voters were really paying attention to the fact that this was a George Cukor film, it's evident that his touch is present, and his touch is part of what helped boost the film's popularity upon release and what's kept it beloved over the years. Even through what may appear static or forced at times, he finds great performances. Audrey Hepburn is commanding and fiery, and Stanley Holloway's performance is delightful and charming. Gladys Cooper is fantastic as the mother of Henry Higgins, who does everything she can to remind her son of how unlikable he is. Rex Harrison is... well, a lot of people really liked this performance. Cukor came in for what he knew would probably be the highest profile job of his career. He did his job while leaving a bit, if maybe not enough for my taste, of his own touch. And he was awarded. Cukor found that with a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work, his legacy as a director could be secured. The Sound of Music is the 1965 adaptation of the Broadway musical of the same name with music and lyrics by Rodgers and Hammerstein and book by Howard Lindsay and Russell Crouse. Based on the 1949 memoir of Maria von Trapp, the story follows a free-spirited nun who's sent to care for the 7 children of a widowed naval captain. The film was a box office juggernaut, holding the record for the longest initial run of a film, spring 1965 to Labor Day 1969, and the film garnered 10 Oscar nominations with 5 wins, including Best Director for Robert Wise and Best Picture. Even if you've never seen The Sound of Music, you may know some of its songs. Do Re Mi, So Long Farewell, 16 Going on 17. Holiday radio stations continue to put My Favorite Things in rotation every year. These songs are courtesy of the iconic songwriting team of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Together and separately, Rodgers and Hammerstein had careers that most musicians would only dream of. With Lorenz Hart, Rodgers wrote many musicals including successes like Pal Joey, Babes in Arms, and Too Many Girls. With Jerome Kern, Oscar Hammerstein II revolutionized the Broadway musical with Showboat, and brought new possibilities to the movie musical with its subsequent 1936 film adaptation. In 1943, Rodgers and Hammerstein teamed up for the first time on a musical adaptation of the play Green Grow the Lilacs after Hart was too ill to collaborate with Rodgers himself. The result, Oklahoma, changed the face of the American musical theater forever. For the first time, the musical comedy simply became the musical. The songs in a show suddenly revolved around the plot rather than the plot revolving around the songs. The duo sought to use the music to enhance the story, making the musical a fully immersive and emotional experience. Oklahoma was immediately a massive hit, running for an unprecedented 5 years on Broadway. The duo continued their success with shows that challenged theater audiences of the time and innovated the ways music could be utilized to tell stories. Carousel featured one of the first anti-heroes in musical theater and tackled the issue of domestic abuse. South Pacific dealt with the problems of racism during World War II. The duo also made their mark on early television, writing their own adaptation of the classic fairy tale Cinderella, which drew in 107 million viewers during its broadcast in March 1957 and was later remade twice, in 1965 and in 1997, which gave us this moment which I treasure dearly.
This is the note. Why are you down there? Please do that.
Many of their songs also became cultural staples. Oh, What a Beautiful Mornin', Some Enchanted Evening, and Getting to Know You, just to name a few. If it hasn't been made clear yet, Rodgers and Hammerstein were, and still are, a huge deal. They dominated the musical theater conversation in a way that no composer had up to that point, and the landscape of musical theater and movie musicals was shaped by their works. In a New York Times interview in 2000, Stephen Sondheim said of his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein II, "What few people understand is that Oscar's big contribution to the theater was as a theoretician, as an innovator. People don't understand how experimental Showboat and Oklahoma felt at the time they were done." Mary Martin, who'd worked with Rodgers and Hammerstein in the original Broadway production of South Pacific, approached the duo with a favor. She was to be in a play about a family of singers in Austria during World War II, and she was hoping they'd contribute a song. Before long, what was originally to be a non-musical play evolved into a full-fledged musical vehicle for Martin. Around this time, though, Hammerstein was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He missed the show's out-of-town tryout in Boston, indicating to the cast and crew that something was up. Nevertheless, he and Rodgers still found ways to edit the show's numbers as it was preparing for its opening on Broadway. The show opened in November 1959, and in August of 1960, Oscar Hammerstein II passed away, confirming that The Sound of Music would be his final show. 20th Century Fox had a tumultuous few years in the early 60s. The budget for Cleopatra, a big studio epic starring Elizabeth Taylor akin to Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, ballooned endlessly between its huge lavish sets, large number of extras, Elizabeth Taylor needing an emergency tracheotomy, and the film's director being replaced during production, just to name a few on-set incidents. The film nearly bankrupted Fox, which shut down production on many of its other films to try to offset costs. Add to this the sudden passing of 20th Century Fox's most bankable star, Marilyn Monroe, who was in the middle of her own production at the time of her death. The company needed a hit, and they needed it as soon as possible. Fox had bought the film rights for The Sound of Music back in June 1960, 2 months after it tied for Best Musical at that year's Tony Awards and before most of Fox's financial loss went down. Following the immense critical and financial success of United Artists' West Side Story, and given the success Fox had had with other Rodgers and Hammerstein films, Carousel, South Pacific, and The King and I, Fox president Richard Zanuck hired screenwriter Ernest Lehman to adapt The Sound of Music in December 1962. One of the show's elements that divided critics during its original Broadway run was that it was too saccharine, which, in a world with edgier films like The Apartment and the works of Tennessee Williams, didn't always read well to an audience. Lehman, from the jump, did his best to tone down the more syrupy moments of the source material. Robert Wise, who won the Oscar for co-directing West Side Story, was brought on to direct after his next film, The Sand Pebbles, was put on hiatus. Lehman and Wise cast Julie Andrews to play Maria. Christopher Plummer initially turned down the role of Captain Von Trapp before finally accepting on the grounds that he could work with Lehman to improve the character. Filming took place from March to September 1964, splitting between Los Angeles and Salzburg, with a dash of Bavaria in there for those mountain scenes. The film was finished and premiered on March 2, 1965. Like the stage musical before it, the film received mixed reviews because of its sentimentality and saccharine nature. Pauline Kael notoriously felt that the final product was manufactured, stating, "Whom could it offend? Only those of us who loathe being manipulated in this way and are aware of how self-indulgent and cheap and ready-made are the responses we are made to feel." Bosley Crowther of the New York Times praised Julie Andrews, but panned just about everything else, going so far as to call Rodgers and Hammerstein's score, quote, two-dimensional. Even legendary filmmaker Billy Wilder reportedly remarked, quote, "No musical with swastikas will ever be a success." Which, valid thought, but now I really want to know what he thought of the producers 3 years later. Anyway, the vitriol thrown at the film didn't really matter at all, as it ended up becoming one of the most successful films of all time. As I said in the intro to this section, The Sound of Music holds the record for the longest initial run in theaters. Variety's weekly poll of 20 to 25 cities found that the film was the #1 movie in the country for 41 weeks, gaining its final #1 spot in its 80th week of release. With repeat viewings regularly occurring, some towns reported that the number of tickets sold to The Sound of Music was higher than their actual population. Audiences loved The Sound of Music, and they saw it again and again and again. As I mentioned, this was Hammerstein's final work, with stomach cancer taking his life 9 months into the Broadway production's original run. In the works of Oscar Hammerstein II, story and optimism are key. Hammerstein wanted the audience to sympathize with his characters. The audience didn't have to like his characters, but he wanted them to understand his characters. He wasn't afraid to put his characters through varying levels of adversity, and he wasn't afraid to comment on the zeitgeist at large while doing it, even igniting Georgia lawmakers at one point to attempt to outlaw shows like South Pacific that justified interracial marriage through its music. Hammerstein didn't always write happy stories, but he did always write optimistic stories, and he wrote what he felt the people needed to hear. The Sound of Music is a show, and in turn, a movie about saying goodbye. It starts with Maria saying goodbye to the Abbey, and it ends with the Von Trapps saying goodbye to Austria. Even with a song literally called So Long Farewell, the theme of departing is epitomized best by Edelweiss. In the film, screenwriter Ernest Lehman utilizes the song twice, when the captain rediscovers his own love for music, and as he sings goodnight to the country he's loved and fought for as it's about to be invaded by the Nazi regime. When writing the song, Rodgers and Hammerstein chose the Edelweiss flower because of its ability to live through harsh winters. No matter the weather, Edelweiss is able to continue to bloom and grow. The song operates within the narrative of the film as first, a declaration of his love for his children and the recognition that they will one day grow up, and second, a declaration of love for his country and a rallying cry to oppose the fascist rule that's seeking to invade. And while there's certainly a good deal of The Sound of Music that is happy, this latter functioning of Edelweiss within the film, in my eyes, keeps the ending of the film from being truly happy. But it does keep it optimistic, as Hammerstein sought to do. This same melancholy notion is upheld by the fact that this was the last song that Hammerstein ever wrote. As the captain said goodbye to his country, Hammerstein said goodbye to the art form he helped revitalize. Whether or not his work lived on wasn't up to him, but he knew the musical would continue to live on without him. Edelweiss, in a way, is Hammerstein letting go and acknowledging that the art form of the musical would continue to bloom and grow after his passing. The poster for The Sound of Music boasted the tagline, "The happiest sound in all the world." And while that's certainly true for a lot of the film's score, I don't find it to be true for all of it. The Sound of Music is the type of film that utilizes every minute of its 175-minute runtime to a multitude of human emotions: anticipation, joy, fear, anger, sadness, melancholy, and hope, just to name a few. The way Rodgers and Hammerstein utilized their score to reach these emotions is a lot of why the film was so successful, and why it's lived on as long as it has. In a career with many peaks, the ultimate zenith of the success of The Sound of Music acts as a worthy finale to the extraordinary legacy of Oscar Hammerstein II. So now that we've talked about the films themselves, how did Mary Poppins, My Fair Lady, and The Sound of Music all happen within just a few months of each other? In my assessment, the simultaneous releases of these films have three major factors behind them. The first, and arguably the biggest factor, was television. Upon its introduction into mainstream American culture, television sent shockwaves through the zeitgeist. Weekly attendance at movie theaters went down exponentially, and television began to inform what films did get made. Take, for example, that 1955's Best Picture winner, Marty, was based on a teleplay of the same name that initially aired on the Philco Goodyear Television Playhouse. 12 Angry Men, a 1957 courtroom drama that's hailed by many as one of the greatest films of all time, was based on a 1954 teleplay from Westinghouse Studio One. When it comes to these three films, television coverage was integral to the success of all of them. For years, Walt Disney, My Fair Lady, and Rodgers and Hammerstein had all been huge players on TV. Walt Disney had his television show drawing millions of weekly viewers on Sundays. Performances from My Fair Lady on programs like The Ed Sullivan Show dominated the airwaves and led the musical's original cast album to stay on the bestsellers chart for 480 weeks. A 1954 television special that honored the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein was picked up by all four networks at the time: NBC, CBS, ABC, and Dumont. There was a level of engagement with the general public that extended beyond the films themselves, especially when you consider that many fans of My Fair Lady and The Sound of Music living in suburbs or middle America wouldn't have been able to see the show on Broadway. Television was a glimpse into that world, and film was the medium to make the desire to see those works a reality. Furthermore, because of television's limited output, there was more of a national unification of what was being seen, heard, and talked about. 72% of households that owned a television set in 1953 were tuned in when Lucy gave birth on I Love Lucy. The Beatles' first performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 was seen by roughly 73 million people. Even if we fast forward, we find the 1983 final episode of MASH, which drew nearly 106 million viewers in the US alone. As soon as television was widely adopted, conversations about what was on dominated the popular consciousness, and that only benefited Mary Poppins, My Fair Lady, and The Sound of Music. The second factor is Julie Andrews. Andrews has ties to all three projects, playing the leading actress in Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, and originating the role of Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady on Broadway. The aforementioned early television performances found Julie Andrews introducing herself to the American public, and her voice was heard on millions of copies of the My Fair Lady cast recording. She continued to dominate Broadway when she was cast in Lerner and Loewe's follow-up to My Fair Lady, Camelot. Surprisingly, Camelot was what got Julie Andrews a meeting with Walt Disney. Songwriters Richard and Robert Sherman and co-writer Don DeGrady watched Julie perform with Richard Burton on The Ed Sullivan Show and told Walt that she would be a perfect Poppins. Walt went and saw Camelot in New York and met with Julie afterwards. He talked to her and her husband at the time, costume designer Tony Walton, about his plans for Mary Poppins, and she accepted, seeing an opportunity after having been passed by Jack Warner for the film adaptation of My Fair Lady. I won't dive too deep into this part of the story, as Izzy over at Be Kind Rewind has a really excellent video essay on Julie, Audrey Hepburn, and the ensuing press coverage, which I'll link below. But here's what's necessary. The revelation that Julie Andrews would not be starring in the film adaptation of the role that introduced her to the American public was startling news, and it put an extra spotlight on the releases of both Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady. However, it also gave her the ability to make her film debut with Disney in a role that would propel her into the national consciousness in a new way. Not just Julie Andrews musical theater star, but Julie Andrews movie star.
I made her a stage star. I made her a movie star. Oh.
This newfound film fame only increased the anticipation for her next movie musical, The Sound of Music. Before Mary Poppins was even released, Sound of Music screenwriter Ernest Lehman and director Robert Wise included Julie on their lists of potential actresses to play Maria. To make sure she would be a good choice, they went to the Disney lot to see test footage of her and Mary Poppins. 10 minutes in, Wise told Lehman, "Let's go sign this girl before somebody else sees this film and grabs her." Unlike Jack Warner, Walt Disney, Ernest Lehman, and Robert Wise all had the foresight to realize that Julie's on-screen potential was tremendous. And she more than delivered, bringing a unique level of sweetness, charisma, and wit to the screen. A sweetness, charisma, and wit that helped sell her films not just in the US, but internationally as well. Furthermore, in a Hollywood landscape that was veering more into realism by the second, Julie proved that she had the vocal ability to be both a mega-talented singer and a genuine, captivating movie star. Finally, to put it simply, the releases of these three films being so close together was, well, kind of a coincidence. When I started conceiving this essay, I was sure there was some major thing or moment that led to these three films all dropping and being successful at the same time. Rather, it was the culmination of many things. The rise of television, the obtaining of the film rights to My Fair Lady and The Sound of Music, Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox nearly going bankrupt and really needing big hits, P.L. Travers finally signing over the rights to Mary Poppins, remaining admiration for Rodgers and Hammerstein after Hammerstein's passing, Julie Andrews being passed over for the film adaptation of My Fair Lady. And yes, the British invasion on popular media was a factor of the film's initial popularities for sure, but the fact that these three all happened so close together is, in the end, pretty coincidental. Given how many years it took for Disney to try to obtain the rights to Mary Poppins, as soon as he had them, he was going to make a movie. He just happened to finally get the rights in 1961. And remember how he went to go visit Julie in her dressing room at Camelot? Well...
And I said, "Oh, Mr. Disney, I'd be thrilled." I'd never made a movie. I said, "But I can't, I'm pregnant." And he said, "Oh, that's okay, we'll wait."
Walt held production until Julie was ready to shoot. He'd already waited over 20 years, a few more months was nothing if it meant he got his choice for the title role. Given its immense popularity on television and its incredible record sales, My Fair Lady was going to be made into a movie at some point. It was a given, a matter of when rather than if. Warner Brothers just happened to purchase the film rights in February 1962, 7 months before the original Broadway production was to close. And 20th Century Fox just happened to have the rights to The Sound of Music saved for a rainy day, dusting them off at the end of 1962, a year where they'd suffered a loss of nearly $40 million. All three of these films were almost bound to happen at some point. They all just happened to occur around the same time. I think that's why this subject has fascinated me so much. The simultaneous releases of these three films led to an influx of other, mostly unsuccessful movie musicals, and these three are all films that we still recognize as classics. Top 10 movie musicals of all time level classics. But these films weren't really cashing in on industry trends, especially given that the success of the last movie musical to do as well critically and financially, West Side Story, did so by commenting on the state of American culture while presenting a level of immediacy the movie musical had never seen. In terms of story and content, all three of these films were mostly familiar. And whereas we see films nowadays get specific release dates to cash in on Oscar season or summer blockbuster season or some other variable of possible financial success or prestige, release date placement wasn't as much a factor in the 60s. Intentional release date placement wouldn't become a major marketing tool until the 70s. But all three films had anticipation behind them, helping to launch their respective legacies and to honor the legacies of those who played integral roles in bringing them to the screen. Walt Disney got to blend together all of the innovations he'd spent his career perfecting. George Cukor got to heighten the prestige he'd made his trademark while capturing another set of memorable performances. And the legacy of Oscar Hammerstein's hopeful philosophy of life was reflected in his final and most successful work. And all of this just so happened to occur within just a few short months. Mary Poppins, My Fair Lady, and The Sound of Music remain three of the most successful movie musicals of all time, gaining new fans and admirers every year. Mary Poppins is a regular fixture at the Disney parks, and the film remains widely admired by fans of the company. My Fair Lady regularly airs on Turner Classic Movies, even inspiring discussion about its portrayals of gender dynamics, and the film will be receiving a release on 4K Blu-ray in May of this year. In non-pandemic years, The Sound of Music sees hundreds of community theater performances worldwide, as well as sing-along events at many theaters, and the film has been a regular presence on network television, with many airings happening around the winter holidays. The concurrent releases of these three films are a story of happenstance, with their successes relying less on the time in which they were released and more on how the films captivated their audiences, with charm, with elegance, with wholesomeness, with poise, with innovation, and with a collection of songs that audiences would continue humming long after the credits rolled. In their own ways, the films epitomize what made the works of Walt Disney, George Cukor, and Oscar Hammerstein II so special, and they remain hallmarks of their illustrious careers. And isn't that lovely?